Many families involved in dependency cases have been profoundly affected by domestic violence. Here in Oregon, domestic violence is a common family stress factor in 30% of the abuse and neglect cases. Children are sometimes unrecognized victims of domestic and sexual violence. Exposure alone can be traumatic. Children exposed to domestic violence are at risk for a host of negative social, developmental, and psychological outcomes. Children who witness domestic violence are significantly more likely to develop depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress disorder than non-witnesses. It's important for board members to recognize the unique stress these families often face. I'm excited that we have Ruby Whitestar from Casa de Esperanza with us today. Ruby's full bio is in the conference program, so I'm not going to read that. I will tell you that I heard Ruby give a presentation about 10 years ago when she was working for the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges as the Family Violence Program Director. At that time, I tried to get her to come to Oregon to a CRB conference, but her schedule prevented that. And one of our staff folks heard one of her colleagues this year, and we thought of her again, and her schedule allowed it this time. So I'm glad you get to be here to listen to her. Ruby's areas of expertise include children exposed to domestic violence, collaboration, system reform, co-occurrence, resilience, and cultural competency. Ruby, thank you for being here.
Are you going to want your phone?
Just so it doesn't ring on you.
That's why I left mine at my table. Thank you so much for having me. Yeah, I'm really, really happy to be here. I'm glad I could make it, especially for this conversation that you're having around every child counts as a theme. And I hope that by the time I'm done, that you will actually maybe expand that to realize that every person counts. And hopefully you know what I mean by that by the time I'm done. I want to thank you very much for coming here. I say this all the time in my life, but there's nothing that the most valuable thing anyone can give someone is their time. And so for you to take that valuable time that you have and spend it trying to learn more, to do the things you have to do better, it's priceless. And so I really appreciate you and I respect you all being here to do that. So I'll start by talking about, because I don't work at Casa Esperanza now. I'm actually going to be starting at a new organization next month. But one of the things I love about that and about my new job is that I get to do a lot more work that has to do with identity and culture, which is something that we don't talk a lot about in our work often, except to say, oh yeah, you have to consider that. But we don't get to talk a lot about what that means. So hopefully I'll be able to do a little bit of that here. But whenever I get asked to share my experience somewhere and to share my stories, because you'll find out I'm more of a storyteller than a presenter, when I get a chance to do that, it reminds me very deeply of my roots. Strong roots that make me think of family. And when I think about roots and family, I think of a tree. It takes me back to my school days, and my mind conjures up images of a family tree. Do you remember the kind that we used to have to fill out in school, where you would put, all right, here's my mom and dad, and here's this, that, with our name on the bottom. But when I think of a family tree, it's not this tree that comes to mind. With compadres and primo hermanos and large families that come from many places, I tend to think biculturally. So I tend to think of a Latino tree, right? A family nopal, a family cactus. A Latino tree helps us keep track of who we are and those that came before, because the nopal symbolizes the strength that our families have to flourish where they are planted. When branches or roots of trees are cut from a tree dies, but that is not so with a cactus. If a cactus is strong and well tended, it will flourish even in harsh conditions. A tree that's transplanted may have weakened roots and may not survive in its new spot, but cut a paddle of a nopal and place it in the ground and it will grow. Just like those of us who have moved from family or migrated from other towns or countries. Not only will a nopal grow, but it will still carry the characteristics of the parent plant. Despite being transplanted, it will carry something of the original cactus to inform future generations. This nopal is used with Latino students to add the names of those in their family circle and remind them that they can flourish wherever they are planted. I share this because it's these types of cultural adaptations that are so important when we explore how to be an agent of resilience. I believe there are a couple of things that are universal. One is that most of you in this room and those of us doing this kind of work got into it to help others. Second is that I can travel all over the United States and find different landscapes, cultures, relationships, but there's also many things that are the same. One of those is that helping hurt people and those who come in contact with our system is very difficult. It can be emotionally draining, and it can make us frustrated, angry, and even feel a sense of hopelessness that with all of the violence, dysfunction, poverty, substance abuse, apathy, that nothing's going to change. But these manifestations exist. They are due in large part to the reality that children, youth, and families involved in our systems have faced both serious adversities and traumatic experiences. And a key condition of that trauma is that it can overwhelm a person's capacity to cope and elicit intense feelings such as fear, terror, helplessness, despair. We tend to think of trauma as something that families experience. However, as Judge Mooney talked, she talked about systems that also face difficult challenges. And to understand those challenges, we need to understand trauma beyond that experienced by families. And so that's the place I want to start with you all today. So when we think of trauma and the clients we're serving, what we've learned, and this is a lot of the work of Dr. Sandy Bloom, if you all are interested in learning more about this, but what she sees is that what we find is that people in our systems have a lack of basic safety and trust for a variety of reasons related to trauma. They have a loss of emotional management, problems with cognition, communication problems, problems with authority, a confused sense of justice, an inability to grieve and anticipate the future because they're too much living day to day. So what is found throughout all the research that is needed for people that are experiencing those kinds of stressors is that they need to acquire basic safety skills, emotional management skills, communication and cognitive skills, leadership skills, which we don't often think of, judgment, and be able to grieve and imagine a different world. But when we think of what is needed, there's been a lot of studies, research done to see for somebody to build that in someone else, what is required. And what they find is in order to be able to help a person that needs all those things, you need to be a secure, reasonable, healthy adult with great emotional management skills, intellectual and emotional intelligence, be able to actively teach and be a role model, consistently empathetic and patient, be able to endure intense emotional labor, are self-disciplined, self-controlled, and never abuse power at all times. Right? This is who needs to do that work. But what we find is we're dealing with psychological abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, substance abuse, DV, all these things. And you would think here we're talking about the people that are in our systems. But this is an example of an informal study of 350 people working in social services. Okay? We like to think of as an us, them, but we are them, right? And if we have already talked about people who have experienced trauma and adversities having some of these issues, perhaps we have some of them within our systems as well. What all of this leads to, Dr. Bloom has found in her studies, is it has led to an incredible amount of job stress, which is defined as harmful physical and emotional responses that occur when the requirements of the job do not match the capabilities, resources, and needs of the worker. And this isn't because those workers aren't doing their work for the same reason we all are, is to help. But most often, we don't think about the limitations of the systems itself, right? And their ability to meet the needs of the workers. So what happens is we have these systems where we're all on this treadmill, right? She calls it the treadmill system, where we have too much to do. We have unnecessary, useless paperwork that we're filling out over and over and over. We have random interruptions. We have demands from supervisors. We have pervasive uncertainty as an organization. We have changes constantly that are unannounced or aren't explained. We have decreased funding, which all of these then lead to mistrust, unfairness, and vicious office politics at times. If there's unclear policies in our systems with no sense of direction, we have a career and job ambiguity, resulting in feelings of helplessness and lack of control. We have no feedback, either good or bad, and no appreciation for what we do, because we only hear the criticism, right? Either up or down the chain of command. And so as a result, we can see that our systems of helping, our helping systems, are in a state of crisis. We can see that in the fact that the turnover rates in jobs related to addictions and child welfare programs are 50%. You are in a constant state of turning over 50% of your staff. There's an incredibly high workload that is extremely complex with very little training. There's ambiguous roles. We a lot of times get people to try to do certain parts that need to be done, but there's not a lot of time to give the kind of clarity that would be needed. There's absent management, there's a lack of racial and cultural diversity, there's ambiguity about the regulations that govern the delivery, and sometimes even some that conflict with each other. There's a lack of mission clarity, creativity, a host of ethical dilemmas that we're all dealing with, this distress. And so as a result, what Sandy Bloom sees is that we then have, she uses the term caregiver to be these helping providers, right? So then, as a result of living in this system, we then have providers helping people that lack a sense of basic safety, that have a loss of emotional management, problems with cognition and authority, communication issues, a confused sense of justice, trying to make sense of what is it that they're actually doing here, right? Because organizations, like individuals, are living complex adaptive systems. And being alive, they're vulnerable to stress, particularly chronic and repetitive stress. And organizations, like individuals, can be traumatized. We don't think of it that way. We don't have an understanding of trauma that incorporates that scope. But it can be just as devastating for organizations and the people in it as it is for individuals. Because chronic stress, you live in chronic crisis as a result of it. And this leads to organizational hyperarousal, leading to all of these problems that we talked about. Communication breaks down. You have conflict that increases. You get criticized all the time. You have increased silos. The loss of memory, you keep doing the same thing over and over, right? Sometimes we mask our limitations by saying, it's not working. Something's not working, but we keep doing the same thing over and over. We're repeating the failed strategies knowing that they're not getting us to the places that we need, right? we start having less participation, a loss of critical thinking skills. And what happens a lot in organizations is those people that start complaining about that, we start silencing that dissent. If you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all, right? Increased authoritarianism, unresolved grief, and demoralization. So we're back to this idea that the organization now is traumatized and has this lack of basic trust and emotional management and communication problems and all of these issues that we attribute oftentimes to families. Our systems are experiencing them. And as a result, our systems frequently recapitulate the very experiences that have proven to be so toxic for the people that we're supposed to be helping. Right? And it's the idea of intent versus impact. It's never our intention to do that. But because of the trauma that everyone is experiencing, that can very easily be the impact. Unfortunately, in the places where people need help the most, this is the paradigm that we're operating in. Fostering resilience in the midst of this requires transformational change. But transformational change, just like the kind we expect and hope for from our children, youth, and families, can only come from recognizing and changing those paradigms. Dr. Stephen Covey described a paradigm as a map inlaid in the mind which determines the way you see the world. They are conditioned by our upbringing, family, friends, culture, society. They are deeply rooted, and we seldom scrutinize them. But changing the way we see the world, shifting our paradigm, requires deep personal change. And think about how difficult it is to make even small behavioral changes. Let's use procrastination, for example. How many of people in this room have ever vowed to stop procrastinating? All right, raise your hand. Okay. How long did you put it off? All right, probably still, right? Right? So grasping the difficulty of merely changing a behavior like procrastination, or going to the gym, or quitting smoking, which, these are all very difficult. And they help us understand how shifting paradigms is a completely different order of magnitude. The truth is, you can take in new information, but that does not change paradigms. You can acquire skills and techniques in a certain practice, but that does not change paradigms. Changing paradigms requires nothing less than a transformation in our hearts and minds that reframes our mental map. Since I'm here to talk about resilience and building strength in youth, families, communities, I'd like to start this by sharing a few stories with you that I hope will help create new passages along your mental map. And first, I want to share the story of the bee. So according to 20th century folklore, the laws of physics and aerodynamics all proved that a bee should not be able to fly. Right? Some of you probably know that story. So what was found through science was that the weight of the bee relative to the size of its wings, air resistance, and the amount of beats per second should make it physically impossible. Everything else that flew fit within this scientific definition except the bee. Upon further study, scientists found that the calculations which purported to show that a bee should not be able to fly were based on a simplified linear treatment that ignored the effects of dynamic stall. Dynamic stall is an airflow separation that induces a large vortex above the wing. The bee can fly because its wings encounter dynamic stall in every oscillation cycle. The oscillations are fast compared to the speed of flight, and the angle of the wings changes rapidly compared to airflow direction. And it's a little complicated, but basically, I always read that word for word, but basically it means that instead of the smooth, graceful flutter that we associate with flight, a bee flies kind of like this, flapping their wings in every direction. And that's the kind of flight that I can relate to. So, simply put, the complexities of flight were oversimplified. While the flight and wing movements of bees are quite complicated, demonstrating that there is a crucial difference between a thing and a theoretical model of a thing. As was found in bees, what matters most is not the shape of the wing, but how it is moved and continually altered to counteract the numerous forces that are weighing it down. Information on the dire facts, theories, and statistics associated with children exposed to violence and other trauma are everywhere. I'm not going to talk about that. You could Google it, right? But automatic responses can aggravate that harm, and that's the part I want to talk about. What we need is new, improved models that account for the crucial difference between a person and a theoretical model of a person. We need to know more about the dynamic stall of human beings. Years of resiliency research have led to the development of a framework for tapping resilience. I love this figure because it demonstrates very clearly that we need to examine individual and systemic beliefs, the conditions of empowerment, operational strategies, and individual and societal outcomes. However, unlike many frameworks, which are based on problem-focused needs assessments, the tipping point at the bottom of this triangle, where it all rests, it teeters on the planner's belief about the nature of resilience. If you don't believe in the power of resilience to move from at risk, the numerous forces that are dragging something downward, to resilient, how wings are moved and continually altered to counteract it, the foundation that we need to have in our hearts will not be there. We need to believe deep within our hearts that it is possible. It seems simple enough, but in reality, it challenges the risk paradigms that we're used to, and it requires a complete change in our landscape, a paradigm shift. Change that requires us to think outside the box, right? Thinking outside the box is a figure of speech that is overused, right? Misunderstood, easy to articulate, and difficult to realize. I know this firsthand because growing up, I believed that I was like a little bird trapped in a box where I could not spread my wings. There were good times in that box. Sometimes it felt safe, familiar, provided shelter, water, seeds, protected me from the unknown. But sometimes it was scary, and I struggled in it when something got close. These struggles damaged my wings, injured my spirit, and silenced my song. Sometimes others looked in or lifted the lid off that box, but my wings weren't quite strong enough to carry my weight and lift me up toward the skies. But those people did lay down a feather that I could use to replace some of the ones that I had damaged, lost, or had stolen from me. And I may not have realized it at the time, but this is how I built my wings. My earliest memory is peering out of a 2-bedroom trailer in Pomona, California, where my mom, me, and 3 siblings were living with my aunt and uncle when she fled my abusive father. And out of the window in the driveway stood my mother, and next to her, my father. And at this point, we'd been gone for a couple of months, and for the last several weekends, he'd showed up with flowers and presents and taking her out to new and exciting places. And as I tried to survey the scene without being noticed, many things became engraved in my mind. I remember the perfect crease of my father's jeans, the impeccably sleek and slicked back style of his hair, the distressed look he wore on his face, and the redness and moisture that blanketed his eyes. I remember the softness with which he caressed my mother's cheek and admired her beauty and flashed his charming smile. I remember my mom had her head down as if reading something off the sidewalk. I think now perhaps looking for answers that would never come. We soon went back home with him, and within 2 weeks, my mother was screaming and scratching and clawing at the carpet of the living room floor as she tried to escape a beating again. By the time the four of us all ran into her room, her clothes were bloody and torn, and every time she was able to get into a crawling position, she was struck down with a kick or a slap once again. Our screams served to distract my father long enough for her to finally escape. Our house it formed like this giant zigzag, and she had to run through, because he was blocking the front door, and she had to run through every room, through the room, the hall, the kitchen. It's like a big Z, and we saw her. She just ran out and, through out the back door. And my dad ran after her, and we ran after him. And we had this 6 or 7 foot tall wooden fence in the backyard. And with the skill of a cat that she'd mastered on the living room floor, she scratched and clawed her way to the top of that wall, letting her body fall over it like a rag doll. She landed on her back in the dirt alley on the other side, darted up immediately, and disappeared into the neighbor's backyard and through their back door. I remember the day when my brother and sister called me caca. For those of you who don't know Spanish, it's kind of like the equivalent of poo-poo. But I decided it was terrible, and so I was going to tell on them. So I went into the bar room where my father sat watching TV, drinking a beer, and I told on them. Without saying a word, he got up from his chair, taking off his belt as he walked over to where my brother and sister sat, giggling on the floor. He held the belt near the top and just started swinging it over and over, striking them with every blow. Sometimes they'd be hit with the belt buckle side. They'd let out louder shrieks, and I could see a tiny little dot of blood leak out of small holes in their arms and legs, but he just kept swinging and swinging. There was yelling and screaming, and it felt like time stood still, but he just kept swinging and swinging until he was spent. And in the end, the 3 of us lay crouched on the floor in tears. My siblings for the pain they had just endured, and me because it felt like it had all been my fault. I learned a lesson that day that would guide me through much of the abuse I endured in my own adolescent relationship, and that was just keep your mouth shut. Because whatever somebody comes in to do is going to be much worse. I remember at dinner when plates started to fly, knowing an attack was near, my mother yelling for us to run. And that meant that we were supposed to lock ourselves into my sister's room and barricade ourselves inside. I remember by this point we had 6 kids that would push a dresser in front of a bedroom door. And I remember hearing her screams. I remember the fear that we felt and the guilt that we felt safe when she was not. But I also remember understanding that we were not to come out of the room until she came and got us. I remember being woken up in the middle of the night by my mother's screams and gasps, and all of us that could walk, running in to see my dad straddling my mother with his hands around her neck and her face completely blue. And I remember my little brother, only 5, jumping on my father's back and trying to get him in a chokehold to get my mother freed. He was flung to the floor as my father finally let her go, exited the bedroom, and walked out the front door. Then I remember getting in bed together and thinking we would be okay. We could get through this together because that was all we had. But I also remember what looking back is the most frightening thing of all. And that is relaying these stories and being asked, how could your mother just run off and leave you there? Why didn't your mother protect you? Why didn't she just leave him? Did she get help? I know my family had a host of problems. I know we were growing up in very dangerous circumstances. I know that my family needed help. But not once, when we relay these stories, did anyone ever ask, did he get help? How could he and why would he hurt his family? How was he prevented from posing such threats? What did he do to make it better? This was domestic violence 40 years ago. And though much has changed, much remains the same. By age 15, I sat before a juvenile probation officer and was told I needed to listen to my parents when I went through my delinquent period. Nobody asked what was happening in my home, and I didn't tell. Sometimes fear leaves you like a bird pecking around wildly trying to escape. Fear does that. My sister Xandra gave up most of her youth in a violent relationship with the father of her 5 children, who threatened to kill her if she ever left. She didn't tell anyone. Sometimes fear leaves you frozen like a bird being clasped tighter and tighter around the neck. Fear does that. My mother showed up at the hospital many times due to her injuries. Nobody explained her actions. Nobody asked what happened. Law enforcement showed up at our house more times than I can count. But we never saw that my mom would be protected. Sometimes fear leaves you like a bird with a broken wing, hobbling around, doing the best you can to survive. Fear does that. At age 14, Reuben, the little boy who put his father in a chokehold, was labeled incorrigible due to marijuana use and petty theft. And he became the only one of the 6 of us to be taken away and become a ward of the court. On one occasion prior to his removal, when my father was yelling and threatening my mother, telling her over and over, "Te callas o te reviento el hocico." You know, "You'll shut up or I'll rip your trap open." We all knew what he meant. And my little brother no longer tried to stop my father, but instead got in front of my mother, telling her over and over, "Just be quiet, stop talking, do what he says." My father was just too powerful and something that could not be stopped. And today I see how our society and our systems are just like that little boy who doesn't know what else to do. They turn their back on the violence, do their best to make the partner using violence invisible, presuming the victim and children can too, and dispense blames with charges like failure to protect, which are toward the victim instead of the perpetrator. After 2 years in the system, my brother Reuben returned home, got into progressively worse trouble, more lethal drugs, battered his partner, and was in and out of county jail until he was 26 years old. It was at that time that my oldest sister wrote a letter to a nationally syndicated talk show asking that they do a show about adult children of domestic violence. And I always feel the need to stop here and let people know that it was not Jerry Springer. Some of you are old enough to remember. It was Lisa Gibbons. Yeah. I love Lisa. She was more Oprah than Jerry. So Lisa decided to do a show on the topic, highlighting our family, and asked if Reuben would come on to discuss his violence. I was put in charge of getting him to do that. So when I asked him to go on the show, of course, he replies, "Why on earth would we do that?" And I answered, "Because they've offered to pay for substance abuse rehab for you and mother, and also better treatment for you if you want it, you know?" And I waited for him to get mad at the accusation that he needed any of that. But without another word, he responded, "All right, where do I go? What do I do?" We were taping in 4 days, but it was postponed for an extra week and taped without my brother. Because 2 days after this conversation, he was murdered by a drug dealer for a $20 debt. This was almost 21 years ago, or over 21 years ago. And it still saddens me today because I've done this work for a long time, and I know that overcoming his environment would have probably been very difficult. But what wasn't difficult was to persuade him that it was necessary. I found that nobody had ever asked. An autopsy revealed that my brother's cause of death was a gunshot to the head. But I believe my brother died because his story was not captured. As children and youth, we observed our environment and downloaded beliefs and behaviors into our subconscious mind. They became programmed into our life and ultimately into our paradigms. We acted upon them automatically without thinking or questioning them because they made sense and served us at the time. But if we want to create better outcomes for children and families, we too have to get out of that box. That means we have to allow ourselves to be uncomfortable. That means there may be something else out there that holds a key piece of information that we are not considering. That means each of us may hold only one feather of what families need to be strong. And without working together, we won't be able to make the kind of transformational difference that our families and communities need. You are one of the biggest parts of that change. Someone needs to be asking the right questions. And for that, we only have you. Questions can involve, did the agency help the adult victim with strategies to keep themselves and their children safe? Right? Or have we created an artificial hierarchy of safety? Hierarchy of safety is a word I use to describe a system that operates as if a mother and child's safety is mutually exclusive. How does the risk of harm outweigh the trauma of removal and separation? Did the agency recognize and eliminate barriers to compliance instead of just labeling what's happening as non-compliant? What were those things? Right? To best explain what I mean here, it's really important that I illustrate this with a couple of stories. For example, I was at a child protection agency somewhere, I won't say where, across the country, and they talked about the mother locking the kids in the closet so that she could have sex with her husband. As I reviewed the file, I saw there was extreme domestic violence here, and I wondered, what paradigm existed for this worker to see that that's what was happening? Because in my eyes, this could so possibly be a protective strategy that she knew she was about to be raped. And she put her kids in the closet so that they wouldn't have to see it, right? Another story I heard one time, we were doing a trauma audit, and so they knew we were there doing this trauma audit with the courts to see how they were, working with victims of domestic violence. And there was a victim in a wheelchair, a disabled woman, who her child kept getting diaper rashes. And they were trying to explain to her that she could get free diapers and ointment, and that they were gonna take the child back. They had already moved it and had given the child back. But if she did not take care of her child in that way, she needed to go get those diapers and ointment. She literally explained that one of the reasons she can't go is her only means of transportation is this one van that can get her there because of her wheelchair. And it's a van similar to one she was gang raped in. And the driver consistently flirted with her a bit, so she did not feel comfortable doing that. And the judge from the bench actually told her, well, you're gonna have to get over it because your child needs you. This is the kinds of things I'm talking about when I say that we have to see the barriers for what they are, right? They are trauma. And there's ways that we need to respond to trauma that help, and there are ways that hurt. We need to ask, how are the services relevant to the family's needs? The mother in a parenting class is not going to make the abuser less violent. What services were offered for competing interests? We like to believe that people live their lives in silos, but they don't. Are we weighing the impact of the violence against the risk of homelessness? Are we weighing safety versus the threat of retribution, for example, seeking child support? Are we considering childcare and transportation expenses against employment opportunities and not showing up where they're supposed to? Did the abuser have a separate case plan? I can't tell you how often in DV cases he is completely invisible. Was he held accountable? How? What resources and strategies did the agency use to refrain him being able to continue his abuse? I wish I had all the answers for you, but all I have is my stories, my song, and my wings. But WINGS is an acronym that I created in my early 20s that describes what you and people like you did and how they did that right, how it set me on a different trajectory. It's been what's called the WINGS model. I don't talk in those terms. But I want to share that with you. There is a sacred symbol in the Latino culture, the ancient. I can read my dad's letters in Spanish, okay? I better be able to, because there is not a single person here that can translate it. There ain't nothing but white people here. 3 other Mexican boys arrived. I hope the year that I need to be here zooms by so I can go home. There's about 6 Latinos in here now, and it's good because we talk Spanish. Everyone looks at us like we're freaks, but they also say they wish they could speak a second language. I talk to Gary a lot. I'm sure glad he's my therapist. You know, he's pretty cool and easy to talk to. He understands where I come from. I feel like he believes in me. So were you glad to hear I was doing so well in school? I'm pretty impressed with myself. Guess what? They won't allow us to speak Spanish in here anymore. I don't know why, but I don't think that's right. Mom, I love you, and I think about you a lot. I hope we can be together soon. Updates from the school stated he was a good model for other students. Report cards reflected A's and B's, and many comments acknowledged his great talent as an artist. And my brother reflected. One letter read, "Who would have ever thought I would have ended up in a place like this?" I guess everybody, huh? The last letter I have record of came in March of 1987, a month before his year was up. It read, "So I guess you heard by now that I have to go to another placement. I guess one's not enough. But that's okay, life goes on, right?" He was gone for another year, but his letters stopped coming. Ruben's letters taught me that the most important source of resilience is home and family. Yet most of our interventions eliminate, not enhance, healthy emotional bonds and relationships. He taught me that he had pride in his accomplishments and his culture. Yet our interventions recognized these strengths but did nothing to foster them. The most basic resiliency literature says to teach youth an awareness of others, to accept differences and appreciate the worth of everyone. Yet we disrespected and stripped him of his language and his culture. He taught me that he wanted to be understood and he needed someone to believe in him. But we cast young people off like their histories don't matter, deducing early on that they'll end up nowhere good anyway, and somehow they rise to this very low expectation. He taught me that young people in our systems can do everything they're supposed to do. And even then, the system itself believes it's only suppressing negative behavior temporarily without offering meaningful solutions, so they just change the bar. This is really important to me when I think about the cultural issues that are relevant for families. Because in our systems, oftentimes, I always ask to please look at what you're calling a safety issue and see if it's just a cultural imposition. The best example I have of that is parentification. Parentification is a term that's used to describe parents who use older children to help with some of their older children. We always say identify people's strengths, and for communities of color, Latinos, African Americans, that parentification is a way that we build family unity and that we bond, that we take care of each other in our collectivist cultures. And that's just one example of the many microcosms of the way our paradigms are seeing something in a world that is based on their own paradigms and not those that are helpful for families. Here's the thing about wisdom. You can't get it through training. Training provides information. Information provides education. Education provides knowledge. Knowledge is very important. We can give it, and it can be acquired by anyone. But it is what you do with that knowledge in combination with your personal experience that you gain wisdom. Wisdom cannot be given. It is earned. Interdependence. I received a feather for interdependence when I developed a very special friendship with a girl in school who always pointed out to me everything I had to offer. When I commented on how much I liked her clothes more than mine because all the pieces went together, she said, "Oh my God, no, yours are so much better. They let you mix and match." You know, when she read an editorial I wrote for the student paper, she involved me in student government. When she wanted to spend more time with me, but she had so little time because she was involved in so many activities, she recruited me for her afternoon tennis team. And most importantly, she gave me the greatest gift that up until this time I had yet to possess. And it was probably the most important. She made me proud to be a Latina. I used to pretend that I couldn't speak Spanish. I wished so badly that my eyes were blue. Those colored contacts came out in my teens. I wanted the blue ones so bad. I used to lighten my hair so I wouldn't appear so Mexican. But she told me to just be who I was, because I would be in great demand and I would do great things. She literally said that, "You will be in great demand and you will do great things." I believed her. Peers, belonging, choices, and opportunities for critical and analytical thinking promote interdependence. It doesn't have to be sitting in a domestic violence class. You can get that a lot of different ways. Involvement in leadership and social activities. Pride and love for oneself and all that they are promote interdependence. Relationships promote interdependence. This is why you all are so important. A study entitled "Social Support as a Protective Factor in the Lives of Children Exposed to Domestic Violence" examined the impact of social support in the lives of 80 children ages 7 to 11 whose mother had experienced partner violence within the last 4 years. The results revealed that the number of people in the children's lives who cared about, listened to, and could be counted on by the children, including how many times the mothers themselves were still involved. This positively moderated the relationship between the levels of witnessed violence and the child's behavioral adjustment. Further, the importance of a strong cultural and ethnic identity cannot be stressed enough. We have got to get rid of that myth that says that this happens because of our culture. All cultures have violence, right? American culture has a lot of violence. Instead, it is vital that children have a sense of pride in every distinction that goes into making them the individual that they are. Supports need to contribute to their development by highlighting the way their people, values, traditions, and social supports include important cultural contributions, positive gender roles, and an enriched and responsive social environment, even if it doesn't look the way we believe it should. Natural rights. I was given a feather for my natural rights when I was living with a young man who was abusive to me. We dated from the time I was 13 until I was 20. And it was at that time that he had a roommate who was dating a social work student at Cal Poly University. And they both walked in during a domestic dispute. And it was the first time an outsider knew what was happening. So basically, they came in, they intervened. Once they saw what was happening, they got my boyfriend out of the room. And so it was the young man, got my boyfriend out of the room, took him into the room, and then came back and was talking to me and his girlfriend. And so his girlfriend, this young woman, begins telling her boyfriend what he needed to go do. Do we have any social workers here? Some of you are? Yeah, they're really tough cookies. She's like, "This is what you need to do." And she's telling him, "You need to go in there and tell him that we will not condone his behavior in any way, that his friends, his team, and his school will not accept it. And if this ever happens again, we're going to call the police ourselves." So he immediately went and did exactly what he was told. She then turned to me and asked if I'd like to spend the night at her house. And that evening, over a well-balanced college dinner of milk and cereal, she let me know that she would always be there to listen if I ever wanted to talk. Her feather was free, with no explanation required. It sent me a message and helped me to understand a message that is not conveyed often enough. And that is, there was nothing wrong with me. I had a natural right to not be abused. Safety, non-judgment, dignity, respect, and support are natural rights. Providing feathers for natural rights entails monitoring our messages and using our words. We can say, tell me about the way your abuser made you feel safe, or tell me about the way your abuser made you feel loved, and the ways that he harmed you, as opposed to, how could you stay with someone like that? The first statement assents to the harsh realities of living with violence without demeaning one's dignity or judging their choices in the context of the life that they had. Children also have a natural right to a secure attachment to a nonviolent parent, caregiver, or other significant adult. Research repeatedly shows that the most important protective resource to enable the child to cope is a strong relationship with a competent, caring, positive adult, most often a parent. One study examined the life histories of women who had gone on to achieve professional and personal success, who were all adult daughters of battered women. Each of these women described a life filled with frequent tension, unhappiness, and fear. But the common factor in all of the stories was a supportive adult. Most often, it was their battered mother herself who was able to mediate the damaging effects of a violent home. And grace. I received a feather for grace from a high school speech teacher. We think a lot of times that it takes some formal person, a social worker. It doesn't. It takes the individuals in our lives of all kinds to make a difference. So what had happened with this speech teacher, the school had a policy that any student obtaining 18 or more absence in a class would automatically fail. There was 18 weeks in a semester, so you'd receive an automatic F. Well, miscounting my absences, not surprisingly because I had an F in math, I thought it was my 17th absence, but I missed the last day of class. Since I was already getting an A in the class, it didn't really matter. But I was called in along with my two friends, who coincidentally had missed the same classes. And after our lecture, we were basically filing out of the class. But my teacher asked me if I would stay back for just a second. He wanted to talk to me. So what he said is, you know, this class is mandatory for graduation, and your A just went to an F. But I gotta tell you, you have more natural talent and ability in public speaking than any student that I've had come through my door in a really, really long time. So I want to make you a deal. If you join my speech team for one semester, you don't have to repeat the class. It's just an hour a week. That is all a 15-year-old kid with a 0.7 GPA needed to hear. Not repeat the class. So of course I joined his speech team, but I didn't quit after one semester. I went on to win many speech competitions, trophies, and awards. But more importantly, I found a reason to pursue higher education, receiving my undergraduate degree in speech communication, public speaking. My teacher looked at this defiant, insolent, apathetic kid with the bloodshot red eyes and saw the potential I had to become the woman that stands in front of all of you right now and in front of thousands every year. We sometimes want checklists and protocols and decision trees, but there wasn't a book or a policy anywhere that directed him to give me that feather. It was through his gift of grace that I was able to develop the grace that I had within me. What do you see when you see a battered woman? When you look at a difficult adolescent? When you look at a man who uses violence? What do you believe? When a battered woman does not leave, is she choosing her batterer over her kids? Or is it possible she's choosing abuse over homelessness for herself and her children? When a delinquent youth is not successful in the local program, is he beyond help? Or is it possible that program might not be giving him what he needs? Is the only place for a man who uses violence anywhere but near his kids? Or do you account for the possibility that he will always be their father? Grace enables us to view kids as at promise instead of at risk. Grace promotes compassion, creative solutions, and change. Grace is a touch of truth that lets you see the world in a different way. It is a gift that can only be felt when you are open enough to accept it. And lastly, strength. I earned a feather for strength together with my father, who sexually molested me off and on for several years from the time I was very young until I was 21 years old. It was at that time that I disclosed his behavior, to which he, of course, said I was lying. But 5 years later, my father invited me out for coffee. He had been in recovery at this time for substance abuse for a couple of years, and he was working on his 9th step, where he's required to make amends. We met, and he proceeded to tell me that he had no recollection of my claims, but if I said that this happened, then he would go ahead and believe me. Right. Now, I understood that this was his way of making amends without having to accept responsibility. But it was the best he could do at the time, so I accepted it. But not before I refreshed his memory. Because I remembered, they talk about repressed memories and how it happens. That was not the case for me. I remembered every single thing that he did, when he did it, where it happened, the smell of his breath, and I told him every detail over the course of a 4-hour conversation. And during the whole conversation, he kept saying things like, "Oh, that was an animal. God, that person was sick," always referring to himself in the third person. But I got my feather because I had the courage to speak the truth. I had a voice, and he had to listen. I will never surrender that voice. That voice provided a catalyst for all of my future work. And my father's efforts, though many might find them feeble, provided a preliminary environment for resolution. We have to pay attention to the small steps, because combined, they created a starting point to work through things to get to the point where we are today. A time when my father does take responsibility for his mistakes and for the dysfunction he created. And my father today not only knows, but respects and encourages the kind of work I do. He one time asked me if I'm ever speaking near him, if I could invite him so he can come here, and I'm like, "Are you sure you want to do that?" It doesn't matter what I say, Dad, people aren't going to like you that much. To which he responded, "I have to listen. What happens is if you keep that inside, it's like a poison, and you have to be able to get it out." Sharing our stories provides strength. Relationships provide strength. Resolution provides strength. Strength is a powerful thing. Everyone faces adversity. There is not a single one of you in this room that was exempt from that. With strength and a sense of purpose, not only can one survive adversity, one can transcend and transform it. Cycles can be broken. We can give each other wings, but we have to change paradigms to do it. Since we are often so problem-focused and hear so much about the high proportion of delinquents who experience maltreatment, abuse, domestic violence, and other problems, it's easy to lose sight of the fact that the majority of children exposed to these stressors do not become delinquent or adult survivors. That's just who we hear about. They don't, because ultimately, there is one thing that makes a difference. And that difference is you. Everyday heroes who don't accept quick fixes, who build systems that run as promised, who are gifted by an ability to imagine a different world, to offer alternatives, to change paradigms. Because of you and others like you, I look at the faces of my children, and I see the faces of children who have never hid in closets, or dreaded their father's arrival, or drifted off to a lullaby of shrieks and broken glass. I look at the faces of my children, and I see a bright, bright future. I look at the faces of my children, and I know for a fact that you make the world a better place, and that you make a difference, because you are the difference. I know you change the lives of everyone that you touch, because through the wings of 1,000 feathered creatures, me and my children ascend the skies, and we will never be the same. You know, for the first time, I was happy. For the first time, I have somebody here who hasn't had a chance to see me speak before. So I was really happy when I got an opportunity to come to Eugene, because my brother lives an hour and a half, 2 hours from here in Coos Bay. And he's my littlest brother. And in all the years I've spoken, he's never got a chance to see it. So it was great to send him a text and say, I'm going to be in your neck of the woods. Mondo, I just want to introduce everybody to you. His daughter. His daughter, my niece Mia, is also here with him today. And he is another example of how lives can change. He is the vice principal of the Cook Hills School District. And he's worked really, really hard for that. It doesn't always look super pretty, right, our work. And so I hope that when you all work with your families and with your systems, you're looking at it, you see it's not going to look super pretty, but still, we can do it if you just give us a chance. Excellence, a wise person once said, excellence can be attained if you care more than others think is wise, risk more than others think is safe, dream more than others think is practical, and expect more than others think is possible. Despite and because of my challenges, I learned about the birds and the bees and the flowers and the trees and the moon up above and this thing called love. Keep in mind, a bird doesn't sing because it has an answer. It sings because it has a song. Thank you so much, and please keep singing yours. Thank you.